A U.S. Navy destroyer slips into the Taiwan Strait. It's August 2020. The ship is bristling with precision missiles, radar arrays, launch cells, all of it, running on microchips. On the other side of the water, China's military is watching. And for once, Beijing isn't most worried about the warship. They're worried about an obscure rule from the U.S. Commerce Department, because a single regulation, cutting off one Chinese company from American chip technology, had just done what no Navy destroyer could do. It brought a global tech giant to its knees, overnight. This is the story of how a slice of silicon, smaller than your thumbnail, became the most powerful weapon on Earth, and why the fight to control it may define the next century. Go back to 1945. World War II has just ended. 3 young men are scattered across the wreckage of the old world. Akio Morita, a Japanese engineer, listens to Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech alone, because if he listened with other officers, he might be pressured to commit ritual suicide. Morris Chang, a teenage refugee, has spent the last years fleeing Japanese armies across China, and Andy Grove, born Andras Grof, has survived the Nazi occupation of Budapest, the Soviet liberation that followed, and everything in between. None of them know it yet, but these 3 men will build the chip industry. The war has just ended, and already the world understands something has shifted. The next war won't be won by the country with the most tanks. It'll be won by the country with the best machines to think. The problem is, the computers of 1945 are monstrous. The U.S. Army's ENIAC, state-of-the-art, fills an entire room. It has 18,000 vacuum tubes, each the size of a fist. One breaks every 2 days. It's slow, unreliable, and can barely fit through a doorway. What the world needs is a switch, a tiny, reliable switch that can turn on and off, representing the ones and zeros of binary code. Without it, there are no computers, no phones, no internet, no modern world. In 1947, at Bell Labs in New Jersey, 3 scientists build the first one. They call it a transistor. It's a block of germanium with 2 gold filaments pressed against it. Crude, barely bigger than a thumb. But when they switch it on, it works. A current flows, and for the first time, a switch that could control electricity without moving parts, without burning out, without needing replacement every 2 days, exists. The New York Times buries the story on page 46, but in a Texas lab 11 years later, an engineer named Jack Kilby has a summer alone while his colleagues are on vacation, and he asks a question. What if you could put multiple transistors on a single piece of silicon? What if, instead of a tangle of wires connecting dozens of separate components, you could build the whole circuit into one flat chip? He calls it an integrated circuit. The world will come to call it a chip. Simultaneously, across the country, a group of engineers has just defected from their Nobel Prize-winning boss, William Shockley, brilliant physicist, terrible human, and founded a scrappy startup called Fairchild Semiconductor. Their leader is a charismatic MIT physicist named Bob Noyce, who independently arrives at the same insight as Kilby. Build it all into a single, flat piece of silicon. Fairchild will go on to found Silicon Valley. Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore will leave to start Intel. Their colleagues will scatter across California, starting the companies that make the modern tech industry. But first, they need a customer. 3 days after Noyce and Moore found Fairchild, a small metal ball hurtles across the night sky over California. Sputnik, America panics. If the Soviets can launch a satellite, they can launch a nuclear warhead. And suddenly, Washington is pouring money into anything that might close the gap. Missiles, rockets, guidance computers, and chips. NASA's Apollo program needs a computer that can fit inside a spacecraft, With vacuum tube technology, that computer would be the size of a refrigerator and consume more electricity than the entire spacecraft can produce. The only solution? Chips. The first big contracts for Noyce's chips come from NASA and the military. The first mass order for Texas Instruments chips? The guidance system for the Minuteman II nuclear missile. This is the pattern. Military dollars fund innovation. Innovation creates civilian spillovers. The U.S. government buys almost all the early chips, funding the research, absorbing the cost, and driving down prices until civilian markets become viable. And then, one company cracks the civilian code. Texas Instruments makes the first handheld electronic calculator. Outrageous price, but it sells. Because it replaces something you needed a slide rule for. The lesson that Noyce, Grove, and Chang all absorb: the chip industry doesn't grow by selling to governments. It grows by finding civilian markets, millions of customers, billions of devices. And every time volume doubles, costs drop. And every time costs drop, new markets open. This is Moore's law in action. In 1965, Gordon Moore predicts that the number of transistors you can fit on a chip will double roughly every 2 years. He's right. And it continues for 50 years. Each doubling makes chips smaller, faster, cheaper. Each doubling opens markets that didn't exist before. Chips go from missiles to calculators, from calculators to PCs, from PCs to phones, from phones to everything. Here's what most people don't understand about chips. They're not made in one place. The most advanced chip in your phone is the product of a supply chain that spans a dozen countries, 3 decades of accumulated knowledge, and a set of manufacturing steps so precise they operate at the level of atoms. It goes something like this. A chip is designed, usually in the US or Europe, using software made by 3 American companies: Cadence, Synopsys, and Mentor. Almost every chip on Earth runs through their software. That design gets sent to a fabrication plant, a fab. The most advanced fabs in the world are in Taiwan, specifically at a company called TSMC. TSMC was founded in 1987 by Morris Chang, the refugee from China who'd worked his way up through Texas Instruments before being passed over for CEO. Taiwan's government recruited him to build the island's chip industry. He did something unprecedented. He created a company that only fabricates chips, never designs them. A foundry for the entire industry. Every fabless company, NVIDIA, AMD, Apple, sends their designs to TSMC. TSMC makes them. TSMC doesn't compete with its customers. It just builds. Better and better every year. Inside a TSMC fab, the equipment comes from the Netherlands, specifically from ASML, the only company in the world that makes EUV lithography machines. These machines cost over $100 million each. They use ultraviolet light to etch billions of transistors onto a wafer the size of a dinner plate. The laser inside each machine alone has 457,329 individual parts. There is no substitute for ASML. There is literally no other company that makes this equipment. The raw materials, ultra-pure silicon, specialty gases, come from Japan. The packaging after fabrication often happens in Malaysia, Vietnam, or South Korea. It is the most complex, globally interdependent supply chain in human history, and it works astonishingly well until someone decides to use it as a weapon. In 2014, Xi Jinping stands before China's parliament and issues a command. China must develop its own semiconductor industry. It is, he says, a matter of national survival. He's not wrong. China is the world's largest importer of chips, spending more on semiconductors each year than Saudi Arabia spends on oil exports. Every Huawei phone, every Chinese data center, every advanced weapon system runs on foreign chips. Mostly American-designed, Taiwan-fabricated chips. Beijing launches what becomes known as the Big Fund. Tens of billions of dollars flow into state-backed semiconductor companies. A plan called Made in China by 2025 sets explicit targets for chip self-sufficiency. Companies like Tsinghua Unigroup go on a global shopping spree. They try to buy Micron, $23 billion, rejected. A stake in another U.S. memory chip company, rejected. Pieces of Taiwanese firms, blocked or reversed. Meanwhile, Chinese companies try a different route: theft. At Micron's Taiwan facility, an engineer downloads 900 confidential files onto a USB drive. Files labeled, Micron Confidential. Do not duplicate. He uploads them to Google Drive. He then searches, how to clear computer use records. It doesn't work. Taiwanese prosecutors catch him. The files contain Micron's recipe for cutting-edge memory chips, knowledge worth hundreds of millions of dollars and years of development time. The company that hired him, a Chinese state-backed firm called Fujian Jinhua, then sues Micron in Chinese courts for patent violations, using patents filed with Micron's stolen technology. A court in Fujian province bans Micron from selling 26 products in China. This is the playbook. Steal the technology. File patents on it. Sue the company you stole it from. Welcome to the chip wars. But the most consequential battle isn't over memory chips. It's over the global tech infrastructure itself. Huawei. By 2019, it's the world's largest telecom equipment manufacturer. Its smartphones are outselling Apple in multiple markets. Its 5G equipment is cheaper and arguably better than anything Ericsson or Nokia makes. And it's about to wire up the next generation of the internet across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Inside Huawei is a chip design unit called HiSilicon. It's designing some of the most complex chips in the world, smartphone processors that are TSMC's second largest customer, after only Apple. Washington has a problem. Huawei's equipment is going to be the backbone of the world's 5G networks. And Huawei is a Chinese company, subject to Chinese law. Which means if Beijing says hand us the data flowing through your networks, Huawei hands them the data. The US can't prove it's happening, but it can't prove it isn't. And beyond espionage, there's a deeper strategic problem. China's tech industry is learning. It's climbing the ladder. If Huawei succeeds, in a decade, Chinese firms might be where TSMC and NVIDIA are today, at the center of the world's entire tech ecosystem. The Trump administration decides to act. First, they cut off US companies from selling chips to Huawei. That hurts. But Huawei's most advanced chips are designed by HiSilicon and fabricated by TSMC in Taiwan, not the US. So they go further. In May 2020, the Commerce Department issues a new rule. Not just US-made chips are restricted. Any chip anywhere in the world that was made using US technology, software, or equipment, which is essentially every chip, cannot be sold to Huawei without special approval. TSMC can't fabricate Huawei's chips without using ASML machines, which use components made in the US. Huawei can't design chips without US software. There is no workaround. TSMC's chairman, Mark Liu, promises to comply with both the letter and the spirit of the rules. Within months, Huawei's most advanced product lines are dead. One US official summarizes it quietly. Weaponized interdependence. It's a beautiful thing. Which brings us to the most dangerous question in the world right now. Taiwan produces 37% of the world's logic chips. The most advanced ones, the processors in your phone, the GPUs running AI models, the chips in data centers. Virtually all of them come from TSMC, whose fabs sit along the western coast of Taiwan, within missile range of mainland China. This is what strategists call the Taiwan Strait dilemma. No one wants to disrupt TSMC, not China, which depends on its chips, not the US, whose entire tech industry depends on its fabs, not the rest of the world, which would face an economic catastrophe that would make the pandemic look mild. But wanting peace and having peace are different things. China's military capabilities in the Strait have been growing for 30 years. The balance of power has shifted. The days when the US could simply sail a carrier battle group through the Strait to signal resolve, that era is over. And Chinese analysts watching the role of semiconductors in the Russia-Ukraine war, have been explicit. After watching Western chip sanctions cripple Russia's weapons production, Chinese analysts have publicly argued, if conflict comes, we must seize TSMC. Not destroy it. Seize it. Control the world's most critical factory. It wouldn't even take a full invasion. A partial blockade. Customs inspections of ships. A demand that TSMC restart chip production for Chinese companies. Each step just ambiguous enough that the US would face a terrible calculation. Escalate into war, or let it happen. This is what makes chips different from any other geopolitical resource. Oil you can buy from somewhere else. Coal has substitutes. But there is no substitute for TSMC's most advanced fabs. And there is nowhere else that can do what Taiwan does. Not for a decade. Not without trillions of dollars and a workforce that doesn't exist outside the island. The world has spent 70 years building the most efficient, most sophisticated supply chain in history. And in doing so, it has placed the fulcrum of the entire global economy on a 36,000 square kilometer island in the middle of the most contested waterway on the planet. Chris Miller ends chip war with a scene from 1958. Jack Kilby is at Texas Instruments, about to demonstrate the integrated circuit. Morris Chang is down the hall. Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce are in California. And in Taiwan, Mao's artillery is shelling the Taiwanese-held island of Quemoy. The chip was invented in the shadow of a Taiwan crisis. And now, 70 years later, the chip has become the crisis. The story of semiconductors is a story about how a tiny piece of silicon became the backbone of military power, economic growth, and geopolitical competition. It's the story of how the US built an invisible empire, not through warships, but through design software and lithography machines and foundry services, and how China is now trying to break free of that empire. What happens next isn't written yet. China may build its own ecosystem. Slowly, expensively, imperfectly. The US may successfully contain it, driving a permanent technological divide. Or a miscalculation in the Taiwan Strait might settle the question the worst possible way. But one thing is certain. The country that controls the chip